I'm Alex Lawson, filling in for Richard RJ Eskow, and I'm joined right now by Luke Vargas of Talk Media News Service. Luke, thanks for joining us.
Glad to be with you. Thank you.
So I wanted to just, we've had some great discussions before when I was guest hosting Hartman's show, just about the news of what's going on. And it's actually exhausting to try to keep up with everything that's happening. And in particular, I want to know what happened with the Asia trip, but it's been difficult to keep up with it. So I'm hoping that you're going to be able to help us out here and just fill us in on what were the aims of it? How did it come out in actual, how it happened? And his presser yesterday, can you tie it all together? Is there a theme here?
I'm not sure I can tie it all together. The administration has tried to, and the president sort of gave journalists like myself some assistance in giving that speech at the White House, that televised address in which he tried to recap the trip, which is quite useful, actually, because the president went to Asia with basically two messages. One, let's try to build unity around North Korea, and the other one being, let's try to advance American trade interests. And I was pretty, I left Asia, the tours of Japan and South Korea with the president, and came home and really thought, man, I don't think the White House will really be able to claim all that much was accomplished. Then to hear President Trump list what, his vision of how it went actually was quite useful in terms of setting some contrast. So yeah, the major goals of the trip, as we heard it articulated by the White House before the president departed Washington, was that, we really need to drum up unity on confronting North Korea. And the way that we saw the president do that, by and large, was to try and push the sales of American defense and military equipment to Japan and South Korea, and then to get some political agreements from the Chinese. And we can talk just about that because the arms sales were successful. Both these countries, Japan is increasing its military. South Korea has a big military that makes lots of purchases. So that was something President Trump could check off. I think when it comes down to actually what the president was able to accomplish politically when it comes to containing North Korea, that's a much murkier area where you have the Japanese sanctioning 35 North Koreans. That's basically meaningless because Japan has already tapped out. It's done maximal sanctions for decades now. Difficult to see how that announcement will change things. The South Koreans are still in favor of dialogue with the North Koreans, which the Americans aren't, so there's a point of difference there. And then the Chinese, the major thing that President Trump claimed he did when it came down to getting the Chinese onto the American side of things was drop their insistence that the U.S. embark upon what we call freeze for freeze. That is, that in exchange for North Korea ending its missile testing and ending its nuclear warhead testing, that the U.S. would stop its joint military exercises with South Korea. That's North Korea's goal. China has been repeating that for years. And Trump said at the White House on Wednesday evening, the Chinese premier and I have agreed that freeze for freeze is not the way to go. Well, you wake up Thursday morning and the Chinese Foreign Ministry says that's not at all what we agreed to. We still believe that is the best way to proceed. So the tale of what actually happened and the tale of how President Trump sees it appear to be starting to diverge quite a bit.
Yeah, which is perfectly in character with Donald Trump. He just makes things up, which is so dangerous in the world of diplomacy. But for example, one of the stories I saw was he was meeting with the leader of the Philippines, mm-hmm. and he just lied about President Obama not being allowed to land his plane in the Philippines, when in fact Obama didn't go there because of the extrajudicial murdering sanctioned by the highest office in the state. And, Donald Trump didn't misspeak because he said it multiple times. So the divergence between what's in his head and reality is huge. I think you laid it out. In China, he really, I think, President Trump thinks he's accomplished something when in fact nothing happened there other than the Chinese figured out how to work him very, very well, following the lead of the Saudis, which is pomp, circumstance, charcoal briquette steaks served with ketchup. He just really gets bowled over by this fanciness when, in fact, none of the diplomatic foreign policy is moved at all. So, I mean, that's what I saw. And again, I'm admitting that there was so much happening domestically. It was difficult to see, and there wasn't much being delivered. Is that a somewhat fair assessment?
I think so, and there does seem to be mounting evidence that the president may be confusing American foreign policy interests with the success of his personal friendships. And, when asked, is the relationship with South Korea, is the relationship with China good, or is the relationship with the Philippines good, he seems to answer by saying, yes, I get along with those leaders, which is very rarely means the same thing. And we see in Japan, I mean, you talk about the Saudis and the Chinese rolling out the red carpet. And I will note the Chinese played the national anthem with their full military band, which is a not so subtle way of giving the president a boost at a time he's criticizing NFL players and saying there's a lack of respect for the American national anthem on the part of the American left or something like that. I mean, the Chinese certainly were feeding his ego with that ceremony. The Japanese did the exact same thing, and I've talked about this a lot, but the optics of the Japan trip were clearly designed to favor President Trump. Shinzo Abe, the Japanese prime minister, really went to great lengths to be extraordinarily complimentary to the president. And you're right. I mean, you go, let's say, look at China. The president says that we've moved the ball forward on a lot of issues. And he's, I do think the North Korea example I pointed out earlier is a huge example, a glaring example of the mismatch between reality and his own summation of reality. But you see this pattern elsewhere. I mean, you see during the visit to the Philippines with a meeting with Rodrigo Duterte, not only was there the disagreement about the history concerning President Obama, we heard the White House saying, yes, in their private meeting, he is going to speak about human rights concerns. And this is long the U.S. policy. We say we don't like to talk about it in front of the cameras because we don't think that's the most effective way of communicating human rights issues. Fine. But then we actually, you hear the Filipino president's spokesperson come out and say, yeah, they talked about the drug war. Duterte explained to President Trump just how well it's going, and Trump repeatedly nodded his head. I mean, it's a totally different account of things. And there are real consequences when, let's say, the United States doesn't stand up for the promotion of democracy in regions of the world like Southeast Asia. We see on Thursday morning, the Cambodian government has dissolved the only opposition party in the country. China is trying to ram through a security law in Hong Kong that would strip away many of Hong Kong's precious freedoms. You see the Philippines continuing in their killing of more than 9,000 suspected drug users and drug sellers. And leaving our allies like Canada to be the only ones willing to confront countries like the Philippines on human rights. So much so that Justin Trudeau, if you look at the statements from Duterte, was almost kicked out of a meeting.
I think we're going to get Luke back in just a second. But it's clear to me that what Donald Trump, he's actually like the gift to any security apparatus in all of these countries who brief their heads of state that all you have to do is just lie to the guy, just be like, oh, I've never met a taller president than you. I've never met a more successful president than you. Whatever it is to flatter him, he eats it up. He really doesn't understand that there are foreign policy goals that we're driving at. He thinks the point of this is to be liked and flattered by these heads of states. And I think the big disconnect is that he believes that that is actually meaningful, right? That because he was served his steak with ketchup in China, somehow China's going to stop dumping steel in order to undermine our domestic steel manufacturers and other forms of economic aggression against the United States. He comes back and is like, oh, they're so nice to me. The cheapness that we're talking about, the cheapness of pulling one over on Donald Trump. It literally costs one state fancy dinner and the countries get whatever they want. I am going to go out on a limb here and say he's literally the worst negotiator that I've ever seen. The man couldn't make a deal if it was 99% done when he showed up. He is a abject failure at using the office of the president to advance the interests of the United States, because he confuses the interests of the United States with his personal feelings and aggrandizement. So I am probably going a little broader than Luke would say from looking at the tour, but at the very least, the divergence between what Donald Trump is saying he accomplished and what we're seeing from the political statements following his tour is larger than I've seen before. And again, the reason it was difficult to follow this trip is because nothing happened on it. It was basically a vacation for Donald Trump, paid for by our tax dollars so that he could feel special getting these fancy dinners. But he didn't advance our foreign policy, our economic agenda, or anything like that with his trip. Luke, are you with us?
I am. After a brief power outage, I am back.
Well, glad to have you back. I was on a little bit of my soapbox about, I'm just going to give it a letter grade. I know that's not your job, but this was a F. It was a failure in terms of advancing the agenda of the United States, because Donald Trump confuses the agenda of the United States of America with his personal, feelings of self. He really believes that if he gets a fancy dinner, that's somehow a win, not that he's getting worked.
I think also the lack of familiarity with a large part of the American voting public with the nuances of some of these issues. And that's not to say that I know so much more about the world than people who cover American politics or focus on local issues. I just happen to know a lot about this region and see things, for example, like the fact that the president is talking up the prospect of a new Filipino-U.S. free trade deal as a way of saying, oh, look, it was a successful trip on trade. Of course, the TPP was essentially agreed to by all the countries that now exclude the United States. That deal was salvaged and is now moving forward. Trump says, look, I don't like one-on-one deals. They don't favor the United States, but Korea wants to negotiate with us and the Philippines wants to do a deal with us. I mean, if a Filipino free trade deal goes through, they're the 36th largest economy in the world. They're smaller than Denmark. Korea, who apparently Trump says is eager and willing to renegotiate the free trade deal, we've heard from sources within that government that they are not, in fact, interested in that. A trade war looks to be brewing with China. Japan is uninterested in a deal. So Trump says he, on trade, is prioritizing American interest. He only wants good deals for the United States, doesn't like deals like the TPP, which are too broad, too many countries are involved. Well, if you get no free trade deals in exchange, is it a win for the United States? Is it more important to have those several of those multilateral deals instead of none of the direct deals. So I think on trade, on the sort of confusing flattery with good foreign policy decision making, there are a lot of points that you could bring up here where the record on the trip doesn't look quite as good as Trump portrayed it.
Luke Vargas with Talk Media News, thank you so much for joining us on the 0 Hour, trying to fill in the gaps of what happened on that trip. But in fact, really nothing did happen. That's my takeaway. He had a bunch of fancy dinners and thought he accomplished something, but he didn't advance the agenda of the United States. Luke Vargas, Talk Media News, thanks so much for joining us here on the 0 Hour.
Thank you. Bye-bye.